You are listening to Sustainable from AgriBusiness Global, covering the crop protection, biologicals, and plant health markets advancements toward a healthier planet. Hello, and welcome to the Sustainable podcast by AgriBusiness Global. My name is Sarah Webb, and I'm editor of AgriBusiness Global and host of today's episode. In this Sustainable podcast episode, Ben Cicora, Managing Partner Commercial at Frontier Biostrategy, discusses common pitfalls biological companies make when first starting out, how biologicals companies can successfully scale, and more. Thanks for tuning in. Ben, thank you so much for joining me today. Can you discuss some of the mistakes biological technology companies make when bringing their products to the market?
Sure. Thanks for having me today. Some of the big things that we've seen over the years have been a lot of early stage startups specifically struggle with understanding the regulatory environments. I think that's one of the biggest missteps companies can make early on. It can result in delayed approvals, limited label claims, and making it harder to register the technology into other jurisdictions internationally. And being able to tie that early on with your commercial strategy alongside the R&D, right? So understanding how those three work together is really critical, so you don't avoid some of these early stage missteps. You also see a lot of companies essentially chasing too many markets and never really gaining traction in one area. And that can, again, increase your cash burn. It really doesn't define what you do really well and can affect some of your product positioning. And then the other piece that we see, I think, a lot in the biological world specifically, mostly I would say on biocontrol, is people don't focus on their manufacturing process early enough. So you can end up with very thin margins early. And especially if your plan is to really collaborate and work with strategic partners in your different geographies, there's not enough room in the margin stack for everybody at the end of the day, because you've got to carve out 40% for your partner, 20 to 25% for the channel, and then you have to make something. So these are really key pieces to focus on early on for a lot of startups.
Okay, and in addition to focusing on those pieces, can you talk to me a little bit more too about how some of those other common pitfalls might be able to be remedied?
Yeah, so from a regulatory standpoint, really understanding and doing a regulatory audit early is important. Understand what your assets are and conduct that audit rigorously, and often by a third party, so you're not jaded from internal opinions. Understand what claims you're making create the most value for the grower, and then which international markets will drive the most interest in the future for you, whether it be towards marching towards an exit or for potential collaborators and strategic partners. The other thing to focus on early is really understanding where the product fits. So we see a lot of claims in biostimulants with biocontrol that are very broad. And a lot of times that results in not meeting the grower's expectations like you would think you would. And you really have to understand what environments your product works well in and make your value proposition very specific to that. Biologicals aren't a cure-all, but they are a piece of the pie and a piece of the puzzle for growers to help alleviate resistance development and some other sustainability issues that they're dealing with. And then when we talk about chasing too many markets, identify what you do well and own that market. That's your beachhead. And specifically in startups where cash is really important to maintain, define what your beachhead is and use a disproportionate amount of your resources towards that segment. When I was at Vestron, we really understood broadly lepidopteran control, but I think the biggest piece was we really had a fit in navel orangeworm and tree nuts, and we tried to own that segment, create meaningful market share, and become kind of the expert in that segment. And then from a manufacturing side, focus on that early alongside efficacy, because a lot of times if you can increase your fermentation titer 25 to 50%, that's going to create way more value for you than an additional efficacy trial or two. So understand where you're losing in the fermentation process, whether it's downstream capture or fermentation titers. I think understanding that very early on can help a lot of companies avoid some of these challenges along the way with strategic partners.
Absolutely. And, it's taking a step back to the regulations piece of it. I know you mentioned making sure that companies start early. Are there any other common pitfalls in the regulatory process that you're seeing? And if so, how can those kind of be remedied?
Yeah, from what we've seen so far, people aren't meeting with the regulatory agencies early enough. I just attended a talk from Mike Mendelson with BPPD, and he reinforced that the EPA is here to help new technologies. They want to see these technologies in the market. They know it's good for the market. You almost need to treat specifically the EPA as a partner in the process. They can give you a lot of guidance on what trials need to be done from a regulatory standpoint to avoid a 75 data column deficiency, and it stops your regulatory process, somewhere in that 21-month cycle. And now you're losing time on commercialization. So I think the biggest advice we would give is sit down, do that audit, and then go meet with the agency sooner than you think you probably should, because they can really give you a lot of guidance and save you money on the regulatory front, specifically in biocontrol, where regulatory studies can cost roughly 1.4 to 1.8 million dollars to do that base work to submit, but then can also still take 14 to 18 months to get done. So timelines become critical, and you really have to know what that path looks like.
Okay. And then you mentioned a bit earlier as well, how biological startups should really focus in on their niche, kind of find that market, that crop that really works well with their products. Do you have advice for biologicals companies on how they can really identify or zero in on that niche?
Yeah, I think so. So as you do your efficacy work and build the solution, understand under what conditions your product works best. And I would say this is on both biocontrol and biostimulants. If you're trying to sell a biostimulant in Iowa on corn, it's going to be really hard to show consistent improvements in yield versus in a situation where you may have high salinity soils, stand emergence isn't even. And in those situations, you can show more consistent performance and show more of a benefit to the grower in those situations. It's just understanding whether it's soil moisture, different situations in terms of standability. You've just got to know where your product works best and focus in that area with those growers.
Okay. And how early would you recommend that biologicals companies engage with growers, retailers, and distributors when they're in the process of developing a product?
Ideally, before you even make your first pitch. Where we see companies succeed is where they're talking to growers, PCAs, industry influencers early on, other CEOs who have been through this before and had success. You got to start early and understand where the problems are and what problem you're solving. You're solving a grower problem, not a scientific problem. And that's something that we have to help owners and founders kind of tease out sometimes. Yeah, you got great technology, but what problem are you solving for the grower? And that's ultimately your end user that they have to be focused on. The earlier you can do that, it's going to help with your focus internally. It's going to help with your pitch to venture capital or PE, and it's going to help your team understand exactly who the end customer is and what problem you're solving.
Well said. And, building on that, can you talk to me a little bit too about the role that grower education plays in a successful product launch?
Yeah, I think both the grower and in situations where there's pest control advisors or crop agronomists, and even to the channel. I mean, it's education's key, especially for a lot of these newer technologies. You have to spend the time educating everybody. If you don't do that, there's going to be missed expectations at the grower level in terms of performance and efficacy. The channel will struggle to sell the technology if they don't understand the value proposition that you're bringing to the grower. If they don't understand it, it's going to be harder for them to support because that's their customer. They don't want to lose that customer. So understanding kind of what triggers each level of the channel is really important early on. And, that education piece goes a long way. And in the simpler, more clear way you can present that, the better it's going to be and the more the audience is going to comprehend what you're trying to get across.
Okay. And, we've talked a lot about biological companies launching their products and the process that goes along with that. But what would you say separates biologicals companies that successfully scale and grow from those that struggle?
So I think the ones that are successful are ruthless when it comes to focus. They're not getting distracted with, hey, there's another pest that just emerged over here. Those that can just focus on their priorities that are going to lead to better value creation are the ones that can be successful. They also understand their unit economics. They spend the time working on their manufacturing process, their downstream process, and their recovery. Those are really important components. And I think the most successful ones are the ones that kind of create that regulatory commercial R&D link early in the process. They start with a defined strategy across those buckets, and you understand how to manage the cash through that process. Scaling too fast is death for a lot of folks. You really see people wanting to go out and hire a CCO or a chief regulatory person early on when you really don't need that. It's better to partner through the industry and understand what's going to create value along the way and when you need to deploy that cash better. So cash management is critical, especially nowadays.
Absolutely. And, for companies who are looking to develop partnerships, maybe with crop protection companies to develop solutions, what would you say that biological companies really need to have in order, before they seek out those partnerships?
In a lot of those situations, you're trying to de-risk as much as you can with the business, right? Partners don't want to have to take on risk. If they have to take on risk, it's going to cost you more money ultimately.
Mhm.
So understanding where the risk factors, what can really hurt the business and mitigate those early on. And then again, going back, understanding unit economics. Am I in a margin position? This is going to make a lot of sense for me. If I can't provide margin opportunity through the channel at that point, I'm adding a step with a strategic partner. It's going to be more difficult to get this commercialized. And then lastly is just focus. Like you understand what you do well, own that beachhead and move forward. And then as you expand with that partner, it's going to open up new markets. You just want to build that repeatability in your core market first.
Okay. And then switching gears just a little bit, for you personally, what trends within the biological space would you say that you're most excited about over the next 3 to 5 years?
There's some really neat technology coming. We're talking with a lot of companies early on, whether it's gene editing with some traits to kind of the next evolution in peptides and RNAi. Those new technologies are really exciting. I think a lot of these companies that we're talking to very early who are just preparing for a seed round or just coming out of an incubator, they're looking at what's happened in the industry over the past 3 or 4 years, and they're actually taking that with a grain of salt as they start planning. But I think the technology that's coming is really exciting. I think it's really going to be an opportunity for agriculture to really implement some of these new platforms in a more efficient manner. And I do think globally we're starting to see some regulatory tailwinds that can help facilitate that. Europe's still a struggle. It's a long process. It's
Mhm.
painful, but there's at the end of it, it's very exciting to see what this technology can do. Brazil's becoming more open to moving biologicals faster through a regulatory process. The EPA's got its proposed timelines. It's still slow. You still see delays, but it's still one of the more black and white agencies in the world
Mhm.
to register a product and makes sense for a lot of folks early. So I think between those two things, I think it really presents a huge opportunity with some of the new platforms that are coming.
Well said. And on the flip side of that, are there any areas within the biological space that you think there's still room for improvement?
Yeah, I think there's some businesses out there that are still trying to be the everything to the grower, and I think it gets confusing. No matter how well a technology works or how well a platform is working in the marketplace, there's still this 30 years of preconceived notions around biologicals in general. And I think there's still a very much a kind of a show me, prove it to me mentality at the grower level, which there should be. So I think it's just, kind of understanding those dynamics. And when you come in, be very honest with your business and understand what you do well and deliver on that. I think those are two key metrics that the companies just need to focus on.
Okay. And then wrapping up here, do you have any other advice for biologicals companies that might just be starting out, or even if they're not starting out, who might be kind of in the middle of some of these processes?
Yeah, and I think we've hit on it a couple times. I think, build your regulatory commercial strategy early alongside each other. Don't let those get disjointed. Solve the grower problem, not a scientific problem, right? Understand where the grower's spending the most money to solve a problem and try to identify that and fix that. If you get distracted, it costs money. And a lot of startups don't have the flexibility to waste money. So being very fiscally responsible and focused on your beachhead is really what we recommend to a lot of people.
Absolutely. Well said, Ben. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sure a lot of our audience will gain a lot of great insights from you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Sustainable from AgriBusiness Global. You can find more podcasts, videos, news, e-newsletters, event, and webinar information at agribusinessglobal.com.